Welcome to A Passion Approach. I'm glad you've joined us today. We are here talking with Paula Nilsen, who is one of our contributors. She just developed a multi-lesson series for us called Finding Hope, Healing, and Happiness After Divorce. Paula, we're really glad you're here.
Thank you.
And I want our audience to get an opportunity to know you. So why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are and your background?
Well, when I was 9 years old, my parents told me we were going to be missionaries in Norway and Sweden. That wasn't something that was on my bucket list, but I went with them.
Sure.
And I fell in love with both of those countries. When I was, after we'd been living in Norway for 2 years, we were told that we could no longer live there. They didn't want two apostolic missionaries, American missionaries in the same country.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So we ended up moving to Sweden, and that was such a good experience for me. It's still in my heart. I love it so much. And then I came back when I was 20 years old.
Wow.
And I married. I went to college and I met my husband at the time, and I married. And we were married 20 years. And then I went through divorce.
Now, before you were divorced and when you were married, you were in the ministry, correct?
Yes, we were in the ministry.
You were pastoring at that time, I believe.
Assisting.
Assisting,
Yes,
okay.
we were actively involved in the Minnesota district.
Okay, awesome. Now, I often say this about missionary kids, but tell me some things about being a missionary kid that you think has developed you to be who you are.
For me, it's accepting all cultures, but not just accepting them, embracing them and loving them.
Yes.
You
Yeah.
know,
And I think when you're a missionary kid, you never lose that. I always call it bigger thinking. Like you don't
Yes.
see just a person, you see a culture, you see what you can learn from them.
Yes.
And all of that. And I don't think you can ever be a missionary kid and it not really transform who you are. Paula also had the opportunity recently to write a book called Hello New Life, based on her experiences that she went through. This is a phenomenal book. Tell us a little bit about how this book came into being. What's the source of this?
Well, when I first started going through divorce, it totally took me by surprise. I had never really had I had never really grieved before. And all of a sudden, I was faced with grief. But during these times of grief, God just kept dropping things into my life that really brought healing into my life.
Right.
I began journaling them, and that journal turned into Hello New Life.
Turned into your story.
It turned into my story.
Now, I think we have to recognize that in the apostolic movement, we have a tendency to avoid the topic of divorce. And for many years, it was almost taboo. We didn't discuss it. And I think from there, sometimes we put a stigma on those who had been through or had divorce happen to them. How do you feel is that changing? Do you feel a more acceptance, or do you feel we still have progress to make in that area?
I think we are finally getting to the words of Jesus. You know, he says, I came to heal the brokenhearted.
Yes.
So I think we as an organization are finally realizing that it's not just about praying for someone who needs healing from a disease, but it is about emotional situations.
Right.
You know, if someone comes to our church and they have deep emotional wounds,
Yes.
the only way that they are going to be able to move forward and to live this beautiful lifestyle is we got to take care of their wounds first.
It's wonderful. And that's what Jesus said, I've come to heal the brokenhearted.
Yes.
And if we're going to be like him and minister like him, we're going to have to do that. Now, you mentioned grief, and I think one thing that you said so beautifully was we have a tendency to put grief for someone who is a widow or who's died in one box and grief for someone who divorced in another box. But in reality, grief is grief. And talk a little bit about ways that people approached you or ways that we can approach those that are going through divorce that would not stigmatize it in any way.
Sure, because they're feeling a lot of vulnerabilities.
Yes.
Right. You know, when they're going through divorce. And so I think one way is approaching them. How can I help you? Ask them what they need. But sometimes they don't even know what they need. You know, their heart is just so broken.
Right.
But, you know, one of the things, you know, some people just gave me a gift card. And because I didn't have to think about a meal planning,
Right.
you know, and I could just go pick something up.
Yes.
Something small like that really helped me.
Did you find that when you were going through this grief, it was almost like a fog in your brain? It was hard to just do everyday things.
Complete fog. You know, they say that when we are super stressed, that our cortisol level rises, which helps us not to be able to think clearly.
Right.
So people that are going through a divorce, if we could just realize they're not thinking clearly.
Yes.
They are, grieving. And when you're in grief situations, you are not thinking clearly.
Yes.
If you can help them, say, how can I help you think?
And I think a lot of times, I know for me, even myself, when someone's going through a situation, and especially if it's divorce, we were talking about the death. Sometimes it's easier to walk up to people that their spouse has passed away. I love you, I'm praying for you, because there's some sort of closure in that moment. And perhaps the experience, their marriage was good, their life was good, their ministry was good. Now you're dealing with divorce. And I know for me, sometimes it's not knowing what to say. I don't want someone to feel I'm trying to pry for information. And so any suggestions for us and thoughts about how we can approach people who've been through divorce in that loving way so they don't feel we're trying to pry for information?
I really think it's the approach of the attitude when they come to you. You know right away if they're trying to pry. When someone loses a spouse through death, we often just pour our lives into them. But someone loses a spouse through divorce, they still lost that spouse, and they are grieving for someone who's still alive.
Yes.
And I've heard that the research shows that can be one of the hardest griefs to bear.
Right.
And so I think it's reaching out to them, putting an arm around them, letting them know that you love them.
Right.
And that they are special. Like your husband preached in church yesterday, I am special.
Yes.
Letting them know that through this time, their vulnerabilities, that they are special.
They still matter.
Still matter, that
And
they've been broken, but God wants to put them back together.
Now let me ask you, because you were in the ministry, and so not only did you lose a marriage, but you also lost some of that. Tell us some of the effective tools that you placed in your life to help you begin to overcome some of this and to deal with some of this.
Well, for me, I love a good challenge, and so I said in my sessions that I was happy before, I will be happy again. And I have made happiness.
Yes.
Happiness has come into my life again. And so it's just truly, it's walking away from the old life and allowing God to create this new and beautiful life for you. Noah, his old life was completely removed from him. He couldn't even look back to it.
Yeah.
It was gone.
Yes.
Right? And so, as divorcees, we're constantly going to the same restaurants that we may have gone to as a family, and so the old life is ever before us.
Yeah.
But if we want to be made new, we have to walk away from that old life.
You had to set a lot of boundaries in your life.
Yes, and we were talking about forgiveness yesterday. Yeah. It's really remembering no more. There are things I just choose not to remember anymore.
You almost have to block them from your mind so that you can move on in this healing process. And you had mentioned to me, and I think this is great, and you mentioned this even in your book, that you surrounded yourself with the right people and the right kind of materials. Talk a little bit about maybe some books that helped you and some mentorships and relationships that helped you through this process.
Sure. I think my healing from the grief process really came from God's people. Yeah. And by God's people, I mean Christian counselors. I worked with a life coach. I read countless books, not just books about divorce, but books of triumph, of any kind of triumph. I think one of the book that might have ministered to me the most was someone who had they had a child who had cerebral palsy, just how they overcome that.
Wow.
Human triumphs has really helped me. And I think that's why, this book maybe it's not just for divorced people. Yeah. I had a very good friend. She said, I wish you wouldn't have put divorce on the title, because she said, this is for anybody moving forward after, difficulties of any kind.
Right.
So, but in my book, I called these people who helped me, the people that were most like Christ, I called them manna. They were manna.
Yes. and they brought food to your life. They helped sustain you.
Yes.
You do travel quite a bit. You have exposed yourself to other things. You didn't allow depression to overwhelm you.
Right. Not long after my divorce, my second son left home and went to Bible college.
Oh,
my
wow.
first son had already left, so I was, grieving both my kids leaving and then the loss of my marriage. But when my youngest son went to college, I went on. It wasn't on AIM. I just went to study in Spain to just kind of test out the AIM process,
Right.
And I worked with the missionaries over in Barcelona, and they poured healing into my
That's
life.
awesome.
And I was only there for 2 months, but studying Spanish. But while I was there, another opportunity opened up in the Bible school in Glasgow.
Oh, wow.
And so I went there and I helped out there. I was the cook. It probably wasn't something I really wanted to do, but I had cooked for 20 years for my
That's
family,
awesome.
so I had this down. But I just, I just kept looking outward.
Yes.
If we look inward, it doesn't bring any healing in our
Right.
life. I looked for people to help me heal. I didn't tell them that I was looking for them for their
Yes.
help,
I gotcha.
but I would interview them
Yes.
and find out, how can this person help me?
Right. And I love what you said about you didn't just read books about getting over divorce, but you read books about people who are going through things that they were still living with.
Mm-hmm.
Like you were still living with divorce, but they were living with a sick child or things like that. And then following their example, taking their encouragement and applying it to your life. Really we forget sometimes, but really the mind is the battlefield. And you have to conquer this in your mind.
Yes.
And I think surrounding yourself with the right people and the right input of the scriptures and the right prayers and all of that probably sourced it. And then keeping your hands busy. I love that concept that you would speak to people to keep their hands involved and keep their hands busy.
Right. Yes, because Paul, after he had gone through his transformation process, he immediately got involved in the work of the Lord. He could have spent the rest of his life convalescing, recovering,
Right.
but he didn't. He got busy.
Earlier, we were discussing this concept of you can be bitter or you can be better, and you had a great revelation about that. Share that with us.
Well, sure. Either you can be bitter or better, but either way, a transformation occurs.
I love that. It changes who you are, your countenance, your attitude, everything. I just love that.
Sure does.
And you chose to be better
Yes.
in everything that you did.
Yeah.
Tell us some things that you would give to someone who's going through this situation. Maybe some personal advice or just from your heart that would help them.
Well, if they're grieving, I'd say read chapter 2. Read chapters 1 and 2. That really is the grieving process. But I would warn them about nostalgia, the dark side of nostalgia, who just comes up and rears her ugly head and points us to the past all the time.
Right.
And so we have to recognize that we are actually in that moment and we're grieving, that's not the present, that's the past. God's presence is only in the present. It's not in the past.
Gotcha.
But yet that's where we want to go. We want to be where God's presence is. So I would say try as hard as you can to keep your mind in the present. And if you're not, then recognize where you're at and say, hello, old life. That's what I tell them. Just say, hello, old life, and then grieve in that moment.
And then at somewhere you've got to say goodbye to that.
Goodbye, old life.
Yes. And realize that you do have a future and it is there. Now you, in this book, you're talking about finding that healing and that happiness. And we've talked a little bit about the grieving and the healing. Tell us a little bit about how that moment, maybe that one moment in your life where you realized, I'm truly content now. I'm not being pulled back so much anymore.
Sure. I think I stumbled on a thought all the time that I will never be happy again. You know, marriage is what you want, and family, it's Christmas, it's going out to restaurants, it's that person that you have that's always there, right?
Right.
But I think that thought that I would never be happy again, I made it into, I was happy before, I will be happy again.
I
So
love that.
I think resilience, being resilient in all things that we encounter in life.
Yeah. And I think we have to readily admit, married, unmarried, whatever our condition is, we're not going to be happy all the time.
Correct.
Life is life, and it rains on the just and the unjust, and we go through things. But I agree with you that happiness is a choice. I can choose to live content. I can choose to realize that today and what I'm going through is not the sum total of who I am or what God has for my future.
We're not defined by one word, divorce.
I love that. And my goal in all of this is that we could begin to realize as churches and apostolic movements that we cannot allow divorce to be that word that defines someone and sets them apart and perhaps makes them feel condemned or not useful in the kingdom of God. Thank you for sharing your story. I know it's not an easy story to share. We appreciate your bravery. We honor what you're telling because you're a trailblazer. You're speaking about things and you're saying things that need to be said. And someone is following behind you that's going through this right now. And we appreciate that. We thank you for that. I want to encourage you to go and purchase Paula's book, Hello New Life. The link is listed below. I believe that today someone's life is touched and transformed. Perhaps you're going through divorce. Perhaps you're going through a traumatic experience. And hopefully the words that we have shared here have helped you. I would encourage you to go and get Paula's lesson series and learn from it and let it teach you and transform your life. And perhaps you're at a church or you're a ladies group and you have several members in your church who are going through divorce or traumatic experiences. We pray that Paula's life and the experiences that she's gone through and the knowledge and wisdom that God has given her to share with others will bless you as well. So thank you, Paula, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for joining us here at A Passion Approach. We invite you to follow us on Instagram and Facebook and subscribe to our newsletter and check out our website and all available resources at apassionapproach.com.